again, you find integrity ones, a thing called the integrity recordings on the left. You click on it. And if you have any trouble opening up integrity file, like if you want to review, make sure that you don't have like a pop-up blocker running, or sometimes even something with your firewall will keep it from opening, But usually you'll see a message and you can override and say, yeah, that. It's possible to download these as well, as I said, but you got to play them on the computer you download them on, which I don't like, but these decisions are made above my pay grade. There's a protected software called digital rights management software that makes it so that is the case. But if you had a laptop, or iPad or something, you could bring it in and download something. So here we have the apology, and the first thing to say is that apology has a different connotation now than it did back then. If I apologize to you for something, the assumption is, in some sense, I'm admitting that I was wrong about something. And professors being infallible, of course, I could never be wrong. So that wouldn't happen. But basically, back then, the Greek word apologia meant a defense. So here Socrates is presenting his defense at his trial. And this is not as technical, it's more autobiographical, So it's you'll see, this is easier stuff than most of the stuff we've looked at so far. But it gives you an idea of how Socrates got started in philosophy, what he thought was important, and some other things, how he tried to distance himself both from the sophists and from the nature philosophers. How many people is he making this defense in front of? How many people on the jury? Yeah, basically 500. Some people think it was 501, so there couldn't be a tie. Pardon? No, actually 500. And so, so he's presenting his case, and now Socrates is basically speaking in his own defense, but there are three different prosecutors bringing a case against him, representing three different groups, what we would call today special interest groups. And so there were a number of charges brought against him. As I said, this originally was notes to myself, and then I made it into a PowerPoint. But some of the charges you can see link him up with some of these other philosophers. Note that Socrates is guilty of wrongdoing, and that he busies himself studying things in the sky and below the earth. Now, who would that tend to link him with? Pardon? Well, okay, that would be one. He does think there's an underworld. Not as, but who do we study who is preoccupied with metaphysical theories about the nature of reality? Basically the pre-Socratic philosophers, and there would have been some it really kind of annoys me that there's so many people looking at their cell phones. I just, if that's what you're about, fine. But I find it insulting, frankly. I realize students nowadays think it's more important to text their friend dinner than to worry about something that might get them an A rather than a C in the course. But, you got to make the decision for yourself. Okay, so and who else tried to portray him as a nature philosopher? Remember,
Who did you say would say this about him?
Well, basically, these are the prosecutors bringing the charges against him, and this charge that he's, enamored with studying things in the sky and below the earth. Basically, he's a nature philosopher, and this would link him up with people like Thales and Anaximander and the other nature philosophers. And there's some basis for that.
Like romanticist literature authors do, doing like the romantic novels.
Yeah, but they wouldn't have brought that up at his trial. No, who remember that part we saw from Aristophanes? Note that Socrates there is portrayed pretty much as a nature philosopher, as somebody who denies the existence of Zeus and gets out what we would call a naturalistic explanation that refers to nothing more than natural forces to explain why it rains. This is in his satirical play, The Clouds. And even today, we speak of sometimes of philosophers or academics in general, people who aren't very practical as having their heads in the clouds. And in the Apology, Socrates actually mentions Aristophanes by name and lets his prosecutors know that he thinks the portrayal of a bumbling Socrates as a bumbling nature philosopher is very far from who he really is. So he tries to distance himself. But as I said, just linking him up with the nature philosophers in part is, a lot of ordinary people, just as people today. I mean, people who have very conservative religious beliefs might be a little suspicious of scientists who, accept evolutionary theory or something like that. Well, back then, the ordinary, everyday Athenian, and there are 500 out there, in the audience in front of them, are a little suspicious of, scientists and philosophers, and, So this was meant to be a charge against him, that he makes the worst, and let me put this out. There was some basis for this. Socrates, remember, even though he's fairly poor at this stage of his life, anybody catch how old Socrates is at his trial? Well, very close. He was 70. But yeah, so he's no young guy. This is at the end of things. When Socrates was younger, his training in school was at a school founded by a disciple of Anaxagoras, one of the pre-Socratics. So he was trained in their theories, but it wasn't what he was interested in really pursuing in philosophy. But there's some means to link him up with him. He makes the worst into the stronger argument. Now, who do you think that Well, notice even to this day, one way of referring to a really bad or fallacious argument is as a piece of sophistry. And the sophists were known for being good at rhetoric. In other words, being good at making a psychologically persuasive case for their views and swaying people to their side and teaching people how to do that. And we do that today, except, the places we do that are advertising and law school. It just matters to convince somebody, But they weren't particularly concerned about truth, the sophists. And so this charge that he makes the worse argument the stronger is like, they're like saying Socrates takes bad positions, but because he's such a skilled, and clever arguer, he can, convince people of views that people shouldn't accept. And he teaches these same things to others. And we're also going to see there are a few other charges. So these are some of the main ones. Well, what earned him this reputation was that he, again, was teaching a kind of wisdom, and that he was examining people in the society. He was confronting them. Socrates is a very outgoing, and you saw that a little bit in the portrayal that we watched from the videos. That he had especially examined others' claims to possess wisdom and knowledge. And this is what gets him into a lot of trouble. This is what makes him some enemies, but it also gets him disciples. And the oracle at Delphi. Well, Delphi is what? It's a Greek city, right? And at Delphi, there was a temple to Apollo. This is a real picture of the ruins of the temple to Apollo at Delphi. And there was a priestess who sat and gave supposedly pronouncements for the god Apollo. Even if you ever read Oedipus Rex in high school, Oedipus goes and tries to learn some things about his life from the oracle at Delphi. And what he learns isn't very good, is it, right? No. That he's going to kill his father and marry his mother, right? Socrates does not go to the oracle himself. So an oracle is somebody who's basically a mouthpiece, a spokesperson. And in this case, the oracle at Delphi supposedly makes pronouncements for the god Apollo. So Socrates does not go himself, but his friend Chaerephon does. Now, you probably don't have any friends named Chaerephon, neither do I. Long Greek name. But the oracle basically reveals to him that Socrates is the wisest man. And it's, there's good reason to think that this actually happened. So some of these early dialogues are probably pretty accurate as far as the historical facts go. And anyway, so he goes back and reports this to Socrates, and this becomes a real watershed event in Socrates' life. When this happened, Socrates is fairly young. Now, at the time of his trial, he mentions that Chaerephon as having as somebody who was no longer around, as somebody who had died by the time of the trial. So what Socrates says he does is, he says, set him out on a quest to try to understand what this prophecy that seemed to give him the will for his life of the gods, what it meant. Socrates says, I don't feel particularly wise. So he says, if I set out and find somebody wiser than I, then I can say, look, this person's wiser than I. Why are you claiming me the wisest? So he sets out on this confrontational journey, confronting people around Athens. But this is how, in other words, he's relating how he got into philosophy. And the first type of person, in fact, he actually talks about a specific individual. He tells people, if I mention this guy's name, you know who I was talking about immediately. So apparently it was somebody, it was a political figure in Athens. So he says, I sought out a man who had a reputation for wisdom, in this case a politician, and questioning, trying to refute the oracle. Now, where does this happen? See, it's important to know how Socrates did this. The agora was basically, the open marketplace. And it was not just, it was kind of a combination of an actual marketplace, but it was also a public square where a lot of the business of the town was transacted in the open. And in fact, this is why a lot of wealthy people would try to get the sophists to train their children, because getting ahead in that society meant in part the ability to handle yourself well on your feet and make your case verbally in the open marketplace. So Socrates didn't call up the politician's secretary and say, hey, can you cut out 20 minutes Friday in this guy's schedule? I got a couple of things I want to talk to him about quickly, or something like that, right? He's not talking to this guy somewhere in private. Socrates is talking to him within the hearing of a number of other people in the open marketplace. So he says that he ended up showing this politician that he really wasn't as wise as he thought he was. And so what does he say? He says, well, and the people who are overhearing me, I was disliked by the man himself. I mean, nobody wants to be shown up, one-upped, no, you don't really know that. You don't know what you're talking about. And you certainly, I mean, things aren't any different today, right? He says, and there were people who disliked what I was doing. See, not everybody liked what Socrates was doing in confronting people, about their beliefs. So he made some enemies of the people he confronted, and also people who, might have been friends of this politician, might have liked the politician, and, so some bystanders were also enemies. But now here's where we get, and this came up in the class earlier, we get a piece of what was known as Socratic irony. You say, well, how did Socrates think that he was wiser than this politician? Well, the answer is that the politician, Socrates says, well, look, probably from talking to him, none of us knew anything very worthwhile. He really says it this way. But if I was wiser than this guy, it was in this respect that at least I wasn't pretending that I knew things I didn't know, and so here for Socrates, wisdom is knowing you don't know. It's not just knowing a lot of stuff, but it's knowing the limits of your knowledge. And so he shows this guy up. And Socrates says, well, I continue this kind of a journey confronting other people in the society. So he says, I systematically went to folks in Athens who had a reputation for possessing knowledge and wisdom. And he tells the kind of people, other politicians, but also things like the poets and the writers of tragedies and dithyrambs, writers who are venerated in the society, and we're going to see also craftspeople. He says, intending to catch myself being more ignorant than they. Now, by the way, on this PowerPoint, totally disregard these page numbers because they refer to the text I was using way back a long time ago at Hartford Community College. But let me say a thing about these numbers, 22A and B. These numbers are called Stephanus pages, after a monk who in the 700s A.D. Got out what became the standard edition of Plato's works in Greek. And the Stephanus pages are still relevant today. And for serious scholars of Plato's works, they serve the same function as, say, chapter and verse does in a biblical reference. A pastor in a church could say, well, we have a reading today from the third chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, right? And there might be people out in this congregation that have any number of different translations of the Bible. And so the third chapter of Matthew is going to be on a lot of different pages, in the Bibles of the people in the congregation. But they will all be at the right place if they all turn chapter and verse to the third chapter of Matthew and whatever verses the verses can read from. And so in referring to passages in Plato's works, the Stephanus pages give you a way of referring to a passage in Plato where anybody can find it, if they have an edition that also prints the Stephanus pages as well as the pages. Well, that's just an aside, but, since I'm sure a number of you that are planning on going on and doing graduate work in philosophy can start, writing articles and books on Plato's thought. But you'll need to know that. Well, what about the poets? Well, maybe an English class or class. What were the muses? It's mentioned.
The muses were figures that would come to poets and writers and bring them words from the gods' own lips. They would even tell them truths or stories, and they would inspire the writers to come up with their creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, how is it that a songwriter or somebody who writes a book can seemingly create a new work out of nothing? How do you account for that? Well, one way they accounted for that was, in other words, how do you account for that kind of artistic inspiration? Well, the thought was that the muses were little demigods or little spiritual figures who would inspire, like playwrights and musicians and poets. So yeah, you're exactly right. And so Socrates takes some of the poets' points to them, and what he finds is they can't even explain their own points. They can't even tell what they mean because they, by assumption, were were written under sort of inspiration from the muses. And by the way, you can find this said in the Old Testament about some of the prophets. It said they wrote, under inspiration, the assumption there is from God, and they didn't even understand what they were writing because it was for an end time, a time in the future. So Socrates says, well, the poets could even explain their own poems because they wrote them by inspiration, not by knowledge. But here's why he thinks they weren't wise. Basically, they thought that because of their artistic abilities, they also had a lot of knowledge in other areas where they really weren't very knowledgeable. Now, of course, this is only something that happened 2,500 years ago. I mean, we don't have things like famous musicians or songwriters or singers or famous actors or actresses going on talk shows telling you and I what we ought to believe about animal rights or climate change or something, that's completely out of their area of expertise. I mean, that really doesn't happen today, but it did happen in Socrates. Yeah, I know you said you need. I'm being sarcastic, right? I mean, you could have that happen today, where just because somebody is famous, they're a famous athlete, all of a sudden, we're supposed to sit at their feet when they tell us about, the ethics of animal rights or environmental ethics or something like that. So at any rate, so he says the poets were not as wise as he was because, again, they thought their skill at those skills made them wise in other areas where they really did not have knowledge. They weren't knowledgeable. Well, now Socrates himself learned a trade early in his life. I forget. I don't think it's mentioned in the book, but early on, he was actually trained as a stonecutter, stonemason, which gives you some idea. I mean, this was a very robust, man's man type of guy, Socrates was. And he was also a heavily armored soldier, as I think we mentioned earlier, in the Peloponnesian War. So he's a really in-your-face type of person. So he goes to artisans, to craftspersons, and he says, well, okay, in their particular craft, yes, they definitely are wiser than I. They have knowledge in their own narrow technical area of expertise that I don't have. So Socrates says, in this sense, yeah, they were wiser than I. But he says, in the larger sense, they have the same problem with some of the other people he talked to. He says, but this knowledge made them assume that they had knowledge elsewhere when they really didn't. So they were just like the poets, and thought that knowledge in a specialized area made them generally knowledgeable. And he says this was so negative in his assumption that it overshadowed any wisdom they had from, in-depth knowledge of their own craft. So you can see he's not finding somebody who's knowledgeable, but we sort of hinted at what this does. What does this investigation do, and were people pleased to be shown up basically in public that they didn't know as much as they claimed to know? Well, would somebody be pleased to be shown up on a talk show or something, or on a late night show, or by a reporter? Well, the answer is no. I mean, so Socrates makes some enemies of these people he's confronting, and they were people like Thrasymachus who are very confident in their knowledge, but Socrates is trying to show them that they don't know as much as they know. So Socrates mentions that he acquires unpopularity, he acquires enemies, but while some of the bystanders take the side of the people he's questioning, other people like very much what Socrates is doing. So he attracts to himself a group of followers, usually young children of the wealthy. I think we mentioned before, in an agrarian society, if your parents aren't independently wealthy and you have to help them around the farm all day or in their shop, you don't have time to follow Socrates around after. But he attracts a group of followers, and so they imitate his method of questioning others. So he sort of multiplies himself. But this also causes unrest because, and it also is the basis of one of the charges, namely that he's corrupting the youth. That these were nice, well-behaved young men and women until they met up with Socrates, and now they go around confronting people, in the society on their knowledge and trying to show them up the way Socrates did. So part of the charge that he was corrupting youth comes from the fact that they adopted his same sort of confrontational style. Now, Socrates doesn't think that this charge or any other charge has any merit. And the interesting thing is, there actually could have been witnesses, this came up in a discussion of the Pope's recent resignation, and they were saying, well, if there's any black mark on his record, some people think he didn't do enough to, discipline or deal with these cases of child sexual abuse by priests. But you often get people, and there were mentioned some things, in these cases where someone is now an adult, and they didn't know what to do when they were young. But now that they're an adult and they're free and they have some autonomy, they say, hey, look, this priest took advantage of me when I was young. And now I'm not trying to smear priests, but I'm trying to say that the same thing could have been done at Socrates' trial if some young men, remember, he's 70 years old now. He's been doing this for years. Some of his original followers, who were very young men when they first started following him, are now autonomous. They're well entrenched in society. They could have come forward and testified against him and said, you know what, Socrates really messed up my mind. But one of the things Socrates points out at the end of this long dialogue is nobody did. Nobody did when they could have, and some of them are adults now. Nor did the parents of people. So again, Socrates' general view of the charges brought against them are that they're the same kind of charges that could have been brought against any philosopher. That these are just sort of stock charges, ones which all philosophers are vulnerable to, and certainly, that he studies things in the sky and above the earth. Anybody who was influenced by the nature philosophers would fall prey to that. Many of them did not believe in the gods. making the worst argument the stronger. But now, the discussion goes to this because the other area where Socrates was thought to have corrupted the youth of Athens had to do with the charge of impiety and what that meant. There were 3 prosecutors, and I'm not going to ask you their names, but Miletus is one of them. Anytus and Lycon. 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 And basically, and I haven't looked at it recently, but they represented roughly these 3 groups of people. The political figures, what we would call today special interest groups. Literary artists like the poets and playwrights and the artisans. But Miletus is one of his main prosecutors. Now, one of the things that I really edited down in this sort of shortened version is this discussion, because it goes on for several pages as to just what they want to charge Socrates with when they want to charge him with impiety. Because they say, look, he's corrupting the youth of Athens because he doesn't believe in the gods in whom the city believes, and he's teaching the youth to do that. But Socrates follows a different group of gods. So that's one charge. But Socrates, when he discusses that, and a little bit more of the charge comes out, besides saying that Socrates is leading the youth away to following other gods than the ones the city believes in and approves of, there also is the charge that he doesn't believe in any gods at all. That what he's really teaching the youth of Athens is to be atheists and totally reject. Now, do these come the same thing? They really,
How can we charge get them to believe in other gods and then being charged for not believing in the gods?
Right. And you wouldn't. Now, from the standpoint, if you brought a completely different perspective, from the standpoint of monotheistic religions, like in the Old Testament, the non-monotheistic religions and the people who followed them, the word that you get in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint translation, that is applied to them by the Hebrews is the word that they are atheoi. That is that they don't believe in any gods at all. Because the assumption of monotheism was that only one God exists. That even if they believe in all this pantheon, much like the Greeks did, that effectively they were atheists. But in Socrates' day, this would have been thought a contradiction. Yeah. Go ahead.
At this point in history, was the main religion Christianity? Have they moved to monotheistic? Or are they still practicing? No. The time that basically this was almost the time for the Hebrews between the Testaments, the 400s. BC or BCE. Now the 700s, where some of the pre-Socratics lived, would have been the time when some of the Old Testament prophets lived. But this is well before that. But that stuff is going on in Jerusalem. Maybe I shouldn't have brought it up, but somebody said it takes a monotheistic society
have atheism. Yeah. In other words, you can say, well, why did they call these people atheists? They had all kinds of gods. But of course, the standpoint of monotheism is that there's only one true God, and that those other gods don't exist at all. You know,
Okay.
right? But in this context, you're right. I mean, you're exactly right. This would have been thought a contradiction. Well, are you saying I'm leading them after other gods, or are you saying that I'm an atheist and teaching them to believe in no gods at all? You know, and this goes back and forth for a while. But I mean, the bottom line is that. But here you can see some of Socrates' strategy, that he sees a kind of contradiction in the charges that are being brought against him by Miletus. And so eventually he qualifies it and says, well, you must be teaching them to be atheists. You know. But you're very right. I mean, that would have been thought a contradiction. How can you say he's leading them to follow other gods, and at the same time saying he's leading them to believe in no gods at all? Yeah. So, well, what is, from Socrates' standpoint, what does he say he's teaching? Well, basically, here again, we see that Socrates' focus is not really on the metaphysical part of philosophy. Yeah, he was trained in those theories, but he's more concerned with the question, what is the good life for a human being? You know, so he's, and remember, this is the seat of the Olympic Games, you know, where the body was virtually worshipped by the Greeks, you know. Although I saw a documentary on the Olympics, and they said that only, I mean, these athletes really were naked. We don't just have them, you know. You know, something is absolutely shocking to me. They want to take wrestling out of the Olympic Games, and that was, of course, that along with running was one of the original sports way back in Athens, and they want to take it out.
I thought they did it already.
Maybe they did. You may know more about this than I do. I just heard a little blurb on the radio news. I thought, you're kidding? They're dropping that? I mean, that surprised me. That's like saying, well, okay, you know, we're going to take off track and field from the Olympics, or yeah, we're going to have the Winter Olympics, just no skiing. I mean, it just really surprised me. But they were saying that there was only single women who are allowed to be in the audience of the Olympic Games, and because the thought was they see these guys with these, you know, six-pack abs and beautiful bodies, and they wouldn't appreciate what they had at home, right? So they would let married women go, which kind of amused me. But at any rate, so Socrates says, look, what I'm teaching them is to get their priorities straight in life, and worry first about what it is. You know, don't care for your bodies or your wealth, or having a prestigious job as much as the youth should care for the state of their soul, and in other words, for what makes a good person. Now, Socrates is not against wealth. He said, look, you know, if you are wealthy, if you do have a prestigious job, it does not necessarily follow from that you're going to be a good person. But, he says, if you get your priorities straight and worry first about what it is to be a good person, then this other stuff is going to follow in course. So he says this was really the central focus of what I was trying to teach my followers. And he says, well, if that corrupts you, then I'm guilty of it, right? Now, does he fear death? Well, not at this. He's resigned to the fact that he may be given the death penalty. And one metaphor he uses here, and remember, he was an actual soldier in the Peloponnesian War. He says, look, this experience with what Chaerephon told me about the revelation of the oracle, he says, I interpreted that as kind of a direct command from Apollo that I had to be doing what I'm doing, and trying to figure out what this pronouncement that I'm the wisest man is all about. And so he says, I'm like a soldier who's commanded to be at his post. And he says, some soldier that would be who abandoned his post simply out of fear of possible death. So Socrates, uses this. And so basically where he's going is he wants to let him know ahead of time that he would not take any kind of a plea deal. If they said, look, we'll drop the charges, just stop doing what you're doing, stop confronting people about their beliefs and the grounds for them, stop practicing philosophy. Socrates says, no, I'd rather obey what he thinks is the God's command to do what he's doing than worry about a possible death penalty. Now, there are a couple of takes on this. Apparently, and you'll see this when we look at Plato's view of an ideal state, it is not a democracy. It's what's called an aristocracy, a rule by an elite few. Plato and Socrates both think ruling a political state is a job for specialists, whereas democracy has ruling a political state be a job for the ordinary man on the street, right? The non-specialists. And during the Peloponnesian War, apparently Socrates sided, and I forget some of the details, but he sided with a group of generals that was really out to overthrow the fledgling new democratic government of Athens. And just like happened in South Africa when Nelson Mandela came to power and apartheid was overthrown, there was a blanket amnesty then. And so there was at the end of the Peloponnesian War. Well, one take on this is they wanted to do Socrates in, and they could not charge him with treason, and what he did with the generals, because that would have fallen under the amnesty. So they got up this trumped up list of charges. But, personally, my problem with that take on things is, well, okay, but why did they wait until he's 70 years old to bring these charges? I mean, why didn't they do it right after the Peloponnesian War if that's what they wanted to do? So, I've never been really swayed by that interpretation of scholars, ancient philosophy scholars. Another interpretation is that they didn't really want to kill him, but they did want to silence him or get rid of him. And we can see in what happens that because there was a chance that might happen, that they could threaten him with the death penalty. But it would be kind of like the old West sheriff saying, now either get out of town by 5 o'clock, or meet me out in the street if you think you can draw faster than I. You know, the old West Sheriff. And so the guy gets out of town rather than face possible death. So, again, there's another, this is very famous. Socrates says he looked at his function as being like a gadfly, like a horsefly. You know, that people in Athens were like a big old lazy horse out there in the field on a nice sunny warm day. You know, they're just complacent in their own beliefs. They know what's right. They don't want anybody to shake the apple cart, you know, or the apple tree, you know. And he says, what people in Athens need is what that horse needs, a horsefly to come along and sting him and wake him up, you know. So he says the city's become a bit sluggish because of the size that it needs stirring up. And so this is his function, you know, to stir things up in the society. And he actually looks at this as a positive thing. So he says, again, people like to follow him because they like to see him question others. But one thing he does say is, the wisdom that I showed other people don't have, people attribute it to me, wrongly in some cases. Well, so at the end, the jury votes. Was the jury verdict close or not close? Pardon? Yeah, actually about 30 votes. Socrates says, hey, look, well, it was 280 to 220. And he says, look, 30 votes in the other direction would have acquitted him. So the jury itself is kind of divided on whether they ought to even convict him. But he does get convicted. So the verdict is guilty, well, by a total spread of 60 votes is what I mean. But he says 30 in the other direction would have acquitted me. Now here's the thing. Again, his Miletus, representing all the prosecutors, requests the death penalty. That may seem like an odd penalty for this nebulous list of charges, but this is what they request. And again, another take on this, though. See, whenever in ancient Greece, as for now, there were crimes on the books that had penalties, stipulated penalties attached to them. But in the case, I know we only have a couple of minutes. No, it's 3:45. Okay. My other class gets out at 35. Well, I mean, we're only going to go on for maybe another 5 minutes. Well, the point is, for crimes where there was no penalty, and look at these nebulous, strange lists of charges. Do you think there was already a penalty on the books for this? No. The legal system provided a means of figuring things out, and basically what they thought was fair was that the prosecutor would say what penalty they thought the accused person and now the convicted person deserved. And in what we today would call the penalty phase of the trial, the accused or somebody representing the accused would be able to propose a counter penalty. And what they thought was fair then was that the jury would vote on which one of these penalties. But what Socrates does is in line with his confrontational nature, right? In other words, what he could have done was said, well, how about if I leave here and never come back? You know, I mean, he could have proposed exile. Or he could have proposed maybe, well, give me a huge fine, you know, but for heaven's sake, don't sentence me to death. And the jury would have voted on the two and probably voted for exile or a huge fine, But Socrates says, look, I don't believe I'm convicted justly, and so I'm not going to assess the penalty on myself. So what he does is he has a really in-your-face response here. He does not propose a real penalty. He says, since I need some leisure time and since I should not worry, he says, the function of being a gadfly in this society is I'm such a benefactor to the city and the state that what I really should be given is a state pension. Free meals for life in the Prytaneum, which was the big state dining hall. The only thing that would be close in our society would be maybe the congressional dining hall, in the halls of Congress, where Congress, where a representative in Congress may. Well, and so the politicos would be honored there, but who else? Well, look, if you won in the Olympic Games, what did you get? You got a laurel wreath, right? There weren't Nike shoe contracts. You couldn't get your picture on a Wheaties box. You can't eat a laurel wreath. So very often, the way that a city would honor a really successful Olympic athlete was it would give them a state pension. They'd be able to eat free meals for life in this lavish state dining hall. So what is Socrates saying? He's saying you ought to reward me and honor me just like you do the Olympic athletes. Does that sound like a penalty? Not exactly, right? So he doesn't, and this is not an actual picture of it, but it, it's a graphic. So, so again, he's not going to choose exile because he thinks that would disobey the God's orders to actually practice philosophy. Plus, one thing he says is, look, the same issues that arise here would arise in other cities, and he says, I'm too old to be bounced from town to town at 70. He says the unexamined life is not worth living towards the end of his trial, but what's the jury's vote? Well, it's the second vote by the jury, which is not given in your book, and I don't know if we're given the exact numbers, but it was not even close, because they didn't have a real option, right? He doesn't, and so, they vote for that. So, okay, there's a PowerPoint that I made visible to you, besides this one, on Plato's Form. But we're going to start out discussing this strange story of the midst of the cave and how that links up with what Plato thought philosophy is, and also with his theory of reality. Okay, if somebody came in after I called roll, let me know you're here. But thanks a lot. You all have a great weekend. And take care. Yeah, take care.